Croeso, this is James, aka JP Harker, coming to you with another video. Today we'll get to rather different books that I've read recently, and it's Ragnar's Claw by William King, it's a Space Wolf novel from the 40k universe, and Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. A little bit of difference in tone and style between those two, as you've probably guessed. But, both engaging in their own ways, so let's take a look. As usual, I shall wave a book around. Sorry if it's underneath the camera, but I'm not a pro YouTuber. I don't know these magical things called cameras. We shall start off then with Ragnar's Claw by William King. And much like the previous one, it is one of the older 40k books, and you can tell because things like Space Marines, back in the 90s, that was considered a fine enough word for these things. They've decided to be a little classier in the later ones and call them all Adeptus Astartes. Same thing with Space Wolves, which was just sci-fi fun back in the 90s. And in all the Horus Heresy books and everything later, they're called the Vilka Fenrica, which sounds a little bit more something a genuine culture might call themselves rather than the Space Wolves. But that's what they call themselves in this, and it's fine. It follows a young Ragnar Blackmane, who is a playable character in 40k. So there's the slight downside that we know he'll be alright. And the author leans into this. The prologue is him as a Wolf Lord now, telling a story about him in his youth. But I didn't mind. It's not a real spoiler, so that worked fine for me. As to the story itself, not bad. It was there's a mysterious force and we must find the MacGuffin to face the mysterious force. And the mysterious force is obviously going to be Greater Demon of Nurgle. But they're teaming up with the Inquisition, and the adventure itself is quite fun. We have some orky fun, where somehow a group of Space Marines manage to disguise themselves as orcs and get into a buggy race with some. That's quite fun. And once we find the villain, once we actually meet the villain's quite good. The villain's actually quite fun. The trouble is we don't meet the villain for a very, very long time. It's this sort of abstract threat through most of the book. And that's okay, but a good charismatic villain, or failing that, a good sympathetic villain, tends to make a good story. The old hero's only as good as the villain. I always bring up Die Hard, it's always relevant. So, a little bit of lost potential there, because the Greater Demon, spoiler alert, there's a plague, of course there's a Greater Demon of Nurgle, could have been interesting from the way I remember the dialogue with him. So that's a bit of a shame. But as I've found with the other Space Wolf books, and I really do like this, Ragnar admits to being afraid, even if it's only in his own head. And I really like that. He's also got a bit of a soft spot for a Lady Inquisitor. And these are things that are sort of ignored among Space Marines or Astartes in the later books. They tend to shy away from the idea of courage as the conquest of fear and enter into that they don't understand fear. It's been drilled and genetically altered out of them. And this is much more interesting. It's much more interesting to see somebody who has retained these emotions and is using his training and his natural courage to overcome them, or his dedication in the case of his attraction. Whereas, yes, characters like Garviel Loken can be interesting, but when you repeatedly hear the word unnerved, because they almost dread to say the word fear, it can sort of take a little bit of the humanity away. And I understand that's the point to a certain extent, but I enjoyed this more because the characters were more human. And I'll leave it at that. That's the good part of these books. So, on a slightly different tone, Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Make sure the light isn't on that, sorry. And I started reading it for all the wrong reasons. I was looking at my Goodreads challenge for the year, and I thought, this is nearly all bits of fantasy and sci-fi, which I have no problem with reading. I have no shame in reading these things. But I thought, why not have something with a little gravitas, a little depth, and something that would be considered a worthy book? And this is a bad reason to read a book like this. I will openly admit that. But that is the reason why I read it. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I expected this. I don't tend to read biographies. I expected this to be fairly dry. From what I've seen of Nelson Mandela, he had a sense of humour, so I expected the odd little wink at the camera, but I expected most of it to be a fairly depressing, fairly dry account of the terrible situation in South Africa. And while it by no means shies away from that, it's a really engaging book and an engaging story. And that just really struck me. I can always tell a good book when I'm finding excuses to read a snippet. I don't get the chance to sit down and read for hours on end. And some books, I'll think, oh, I'll crack on a bit with that. Some books, I think, when am I going to get a chance to read some more of that? And that's how I felt about this one. It's quite humble in the way it's presented. It's mainly, or yeah, I would say mainly the story of the African National Congress, the ANC, and Nelson Mandela as a part of them, rather than here is the thrilling story of my life. It's, as he would have put it, here is the story of the struggle and my own part in it. And I thought that was very good. I found it interesting, and I should have seen it coming because of things like Ireland, that the struggle against white oppression wasn't a united struggle by any means at all. You didn't just have the ANC, you had the Communist Party, and you had more radical groups, and you had groups that said, freedom is for everyone, therefore we should include the white people and the Indians. And there were other people saying, but if we achieve freedom, then they'll say it was only because we had the white people and the Indians. So should we include them in it? Should we not include them in it? Should we all be South Africans together? Or should it be, no, this is a point of principle that the black Africans are the ones who are going to achieve this equality? So that was interesting. It was interesting in sort of the tone, but also in the things that I expected. I expected there to be a lot of, again, fairly depressing, here's how awful it was for us. And there is, but there's no sense of self-pity, there's no sense of what people would now call torture porn, of here are all the terrible, terrible things that happen to us in terrible, terrible graphic detail, so that people can go, ooh, with all these. No, you hear about the awful oppression, and some of the worst things are almost asides. So when they're on the transport to Robben Island, it's quite casual when he says, oh, the guards tried to urinate on us. But he'll go into more detail about the legal arguments and the official complaints and the clever and careful way that he went about making change. And I found that very interesting. There's no aggrandizement, there's no romanticism about this struggle, which did eventually succeed. It's all about, no, here's the long, as he says, the long walk, the long, slow process of trying to include everyone in it, trying to be sensible, trying to negotiate, but not to lose ground. And I really liked that. I really liked that it went into that detail and didn't make that detail boring. The other thing that I really found interesting, I have very little knowledge of South African history. I know about the Anglo-Zulu War, I know a fair bit about that, but that's about the limit of my knowledge. So things like, forgive the pronunciation, the Rota tribe, I believe that's how you say it. The story of their history, because there's a lot of that near the start, was very interesting. And the traditions that they had, even in a modern world, there was still this strong tribal identity and tribal tradition. And tribal royalty and the role that they played within government. It was quite an eye-opener, and it was far more fascinating than I thought it would be. My interest has always been European history, and generally my interest in history tails off around 1485. So I've said it a few times now, this did shock me with how much I was engaged by it. But yeah, I would recommend this. It looks like a big, intimidating tome, and you'll, perhaps like me, fall into that trap of thinking this is going to be a big slog of a read, and it's going to depress me, and I'll only feel happy at the end when, spoiler alert, there's freedom. But no, the whole read was enjoyable. It really was. It was educational without hammering education home, and I like that. I really do. So I've banged on about that quite a bit. So it's just those two books for today. I would strongly recommend Long Walk to Freedom and Ragnar's Claw. It's a bit of fun. It's not the best 40k or 30k book I've read, but it's good fun. It's well written. Bit of light-hearted, wolfy goodness. What more could you want? Well, yes, I'm going to leave it at that. Those are my book reading and recommendations for this video. So I shall leave it there with This is James, aka JP Harker. Will vow.